I'd love to see Canadian technology used to basically make the entire planet better and to reduce pollution across the whole planet. Sure. So I'm Michael Skinner, the Conservative candidate for Peterborough-Kawartha, and I've decided to run for a number of reasons. One, I think it's a great way for me to give back to our community. I've done a lot of things, both volunteer boards as well as build up a number of companies, and I think it's time for me really to give back, and I think Member of Parliament is one way to do that. Another thing is, I have two young boys that are 3 and 6, and for me, I want to make sure that we leave the world in a better place than it was when I came into it, and so I want to really work hard to do that. And I think one of the things I want to see is obviously continuing to build job creation here in this community. I always say I want my two boys to know that they can have a job in Peterborough if they want to. If they want to go away, that's fine, but if I don't want them to go away because they can't find a job. Same thing happened with me. When I was 20, I ended up having to leave Peterborough because there wasn't a lot of opportunities in high tech for sure. And had to go away and ended up going to Manitoba and then to Ottawa and then eventually coming back to Peterborough. But the way I came back to get a job in Peterborough was to build one for myself. And that was Operatel Corporation.
So why don't you tell a little bit about what some of the roles that you've had here in the community, because you've had a number of them.
Sure, yeah. So I was the president and CEO of Operatel, which is a software company that focused on learning technology. I sat on the board for Peterborough Economic Development. I sat on the board for actually fundraising for the new hospital when we were building it. I sat on the board for the Innovation Cluster, vice chair of the Ag Society here in Peterborough. Was part of Shining Waters Railway, which is really the train board, which now obviously is been pushing for Via Rail to come through Peterborough. So it's been a lot of what I've done. I also was part of a water technology company that was basically from Netherlands that we brought into North America and expanded, called Rainmaker. And most recently, I've been the president and CEO of the Innovation Cluster. And so I was on their board. We lost our CEO. I was the incoming chair, and I decided to basically obviously go and work in the position to try and find a new CEO. Really fell in love with what we could do with the Innovation Cluster, and so I really stayed for the last 3.5 years and started building the Innovation Cluster. Amazing group of people that are there, both the clients and the staff, and we did a lot over that 3.5 year period. We've got about 119 entrepreneurs that we onboarded. They've created about 400 jobs. They put back about 35 million into our local economy, and we also launched some pretty neat spaces. So we added clean technology as one of our 4th disciplines. So when I became the CEO, we were focused on sort of software hardware, which was part of my background. We were focused on agriculture technology, and we were focused on healthcare, being originally the DNA cluster. I added clean technology to that, and we were recognized here in Peterborough for being the best city in Ontario and second best city in Canada for water startups to happen. And we also created a makerspace at Trent University on clean tech with NobleGen, which is was our first incubated client. NobleGen has become a big success story here in town, and we've gone from there.
Yeah, so let's dive into that, because you have some history with clean tech and green technologies, and that's going to become critical as time goes on, because we're currently facing climate change. That's
absolutely
a growing reality that we have to deal with. And so what are your thoughts on climate change, and what's the strategy with a conservative federal government in dealing with that crisis?
Yeah, so as you know, my background also, 2005 I built a solar company. 2012 I invested in a bioreactor, which is CCS Biocomp, which is just outside in Millbrook. And of course the stuff I've done with the Innovation Cluster. So environmental technology has been a big thing for me. It's been a passion of mine for sure. And so the conservative plan fits very, very nicely into my background. And so our conservative plan is to focus on major polluters, take the basically regulatory fee, if I could call it that, and put it into a clean tech fund. Take that fund and then use that to match private sector money and venture capital money. So to create an investment pool, really to drive entrepreneurs and innovators to come up with new solutions. I don't believe we've got all the solutions today. I think one of the challenges with any kind of pollution, whether it's air, which is really climate change, or whether it's water, which is also a very serious issue, or the pollution of land as well. I think we've got to really come to grips with that. I think that anybody that's running in this election needs to understand that the environment is crucial. When I knock on doors, one the number one thing I hear at the door is affordability. That people want their government to live within its means, and and the things are becoming more expensive. But the number two is the environment. So our plan is really a four-part process. So how do we drive entrepreneurs? We lower corporate taxes to 5% that are in the clean technology space. We take that fund I just talked about and we make an investment fund, because one of the biggest challenges for entrepreneurs is access to capital. We basically, one of the biggest things when you're an entrepreneur is you typically have borrowed money from every source of place you can get it, your friends, your family, venture capital. You've got all of this sort of money invested in your product, and typically the day you run out of money is the day when your product's ready to go. It's sort of the way it always seems. And then you have to make a big decision. Do I protect my IP by getting a patent, which probably you now can't afford, or do I go out and sell a few versions of this technology and then look at getting a patent? If you go and sell that technology, a lot of times you actually weaken your ability to get a patent. And so our plan is to help people get their first patent as far as clean technology, which really secures the IP here. And then the last thing is to create a brand for Canada as being a clean tech hub, work with our different government agencies we have today on international trade, and really take the technology that we're developing here in Canada and export it. We produce 1.6% of the world's carbon. It's a very small footprint. Obviously, we can do better and we can reduce that. But what I want to do is reduce, countries like China and the United States and other countries where the footprint is so much higher. And I'd love to see Canadian technology used to basically make the entire planet better and to reduce pollution across the whole planet.
Now, there's a couple of different things that within that I want to dive into, and if we can come back to kind of investing in green technologies and the local role in Peterborough, I think that'd be good. But the question I want to ask before that is, you'd mentioned a fee for the biggest polluters. How is that different from the carbon tax?
So the carbon tax basically exempts most major polluters. So carbon tax is very much centric on individuals. It's basically a consumption tax to make individuals stop using fossil fuels. The problem we have with this riding, and obviously this riding is very much, it's different obviously than downtown Toronto or downtown Montreal, is that, a very large portion of my riding doesn't have any kind of public transit whatsoever. And so individuals, they need to go get groceries, go to school, go to work. They have to drive their car. That's not going to change. Second thing is home heating. We know that 12% of our carbon emissions is home heating. It's one of the reasons why the Conservative government came up with a plan to help people, insulate their homes or change the windows in their house, or potentially put solar on as well. But basically that plan is to try and reduce that carbon emissions. But if you live in Apsley, you have a choice between wood, oil, or propane. You don't have any other choices. And so the idea in that case, that carbon tax is just going to cost more. Now, there is obviously the current carbon tax has this process where you're going to feed into it and supposedly you're going to get the same amount of money back out. We've yet to see that happen. But the biggest thing is that small business, which pays about 48% of the carbon tax, they don't get that money back. And so, for example, if I lived in Apsley and I went to the local food land, I'm going to be paying carbon tax on the food to get there because it's coming there by truck, and all of that additional costs are going to be passed on to me, the resident that live there. And so that's one of the big issues. Once we have alternatives, you can use something like a carbon tax to get people to switch. But if there is no alternative, it doesn't work. And that's why I think it doesn't make sense for that type of method. For me, I want to see alternatives developed. We don't have alternatives in many cases today, and that's why our clean tech plan, working within things like the Clean Tech Commons here in Peterborough, that's a plan that's hopefully going to invent this technology, not just in Canada, but I want to see this alternative technology built right here in the riding.
Okay, I don't know how if it's currently costed or what the current status of that plan is, but is it planned out so that you know how much money within the first year or 2 years that fee is put in place, how much money that's going to be putting back into innovation and clean tech?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So because there's two parts to it. So one is this clean tech fund that major corporations are going to pay into. But the other thing is that we're going out to private sector and matching the money. And so what we want to do is for basically create what was similar to what happened, I think, in 2009 with the fund on fund for software, is that it's 20%, the funds are backed 20% by government and 80% by private sector. And so it will depend on the ideas. And so one of the big things with us is, we haven't come out with these very strong commitments on, by the certain year, because we are relying on basically every Canadian that wants to be involved in the clean technology space and the environment space. We're relying on them to basically start building this technology. It's hard to forecast what an innovation, what kind of innovation is going to do. But we believe that our plan is going to spark innovation. It's going to spark green jobs, and hopefully we're going to find the next carbon neutral solution that would very well revolutionize the way that energy is done in the world. And we're hoping to find that obviously right here in Peterborough.
So, a challenge that I find that the Conservatives have is that there's a perception that the Conservative Party is anti-environment and that you guys are unfriendly to the environment. How do you go about changing that image and getting people to understand your side when you explain to them the way that you've explained to me what your plan is?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and it's something I wrestle with all the time. I mean, and our party has changed. In the last election, I think I had about 6 pages worth of information on climate change or on the environment in general. Right now we've got a 60-page environmental plan. We've taken it seriously. Andrew Scheer's taken it seriously when he became the leader. A lot of our MPs are taking it very, very seriously, and so the environment is key. And I just came from one of the largest environmental protests that Peterborough's ever had. I mean, people care. And so if you're going to be a member of parliament and you're going to represent the people in your riding, you better care. And I think that's going across the entire country. People want to see pollution to be reduced. They want to see our environment to be one of, like I said earlier, one of the most important things. And you're seeing our party react that way. And we react the way that we always feel is best, which is not that government is going to go ahead and find the best solution and that some type of regulation is going to change people's behavior. We believe that the best thing is invention and innovation. That innovation is going to spark the next generation of new kinds of technology, and that's what's going to be the disruptor in order to start saving our planet.
You mentioned earlier helping people in terms of home retrofits, and I think that's a great segue into talking about housing, because affordability of housing is certainly one component
Absolutely.
of that conversation, but availability is another part. And right now here in Peterborough, I think this past summer has really highlighted a state of desperation in our market where we just don't have the housing for not just even Peterborough's most vulnerable, but even just period. The Housing is Fundamental report says that 50% of households are overpaying on rent. So what is the Conservative plan to deal with the housing crisis that we're dealing with?
So we're the highest now in Ontario for ratio of rent to income. So it's got to be addressed, and it's got to be addressed by all 3 levels of government working together. Unfortunately, I've seen the last year some pretty hyper partisanship between the federal government and the provincial government. We have to get those governments working together. The last 15 years under the former provincial government applied a lot of rules at the building code level, which has made it much more expensive for developers to build. And that's one issue. We have to unlock the land. I mean, we have, I believe, around 17 acres of available land for even commercial side, and we've got to get more land. I mean, whether it's annexation or partnerships between the city of Peterborough and its neighboring areas, we've got to get that, because again, most people when they buy a house, they also want to make sure they've got sewer and water, and we got to get those pieces of service. So that's part of it. Working with our developers, there is a plan set aside by the current federal government, which is not going to be changed by ours. There's a lot of money set aside for building affordable homes and getting homes built, but they're not being built because the programs don't necessarily make sense. One of the things we're going to do at our level when we come in is, one, we understand that it costs a lot to buy a house, and so we want to change the amortization from 25 years to 30. It'll basically reduce payments by about 12%. By eliminating the carbon tax, it's going to reduce some of the additional costs of having a home, whether it's paying for your gas back and forth to work or whether it's your home heating. And anybody under $42,000 a year, we're reducing their income tax as well. And so it's really trying to make things more affordable so people can actually buy a home. Mm-hmm. And the other thing we're going to do, which is I think very, very interesting, is 2 pieces actually. So one is, look at money laundering, because we've seen money laundering across the country raising the prices up. I don't know how much it's raised up Peterborough's prices, but definitely nationally. And the other thing is looking at land that the federal government has and seeing if any of that land can actually be put back into the pool of available land to build. I was at Habitat for Humanity today and had a discussion with their team up there, and I mean they're having a hard time getting access to land, and just like all the developers as well. And so we've got to figure out that land issue for sure. It's definitely going to be a big thing, and I think the only way it's going to work is by bringing developers together. And no offense, I mean, I think developers need to be brought into a room, maybe not with a whole bunch of media cameras and a lot of people. I think it's developers, city planners, provincial representatives, municipal politicians and the federal government and myself as a catalyst, we need to sit down in a room and say, listen, what's working, what's not working, and how do we get this solved? Because it's a national problem, but it's very much a local problem here, and we've got to sort of stop talking about it and actually get down to fixing the problem.
And speaking to housing advocates and people who work in housing in the community, the message that I keep receiving is that it's very hard to build affordable housing as a private developer because the profit margins are just so thin and it's just not a sustainable model.
Yep.
So how do you go about improving that model so that it's worthwhile for private developers to create those partnerships and be able to do that? Because as is right now, it just doesn't seem worth it.
So well, you're absolutely right. I mean, so the one thing is it's about $125,000 per unit just in administrative costs. These are the costs that you're incurring before you put a shovel in the ground. We've got to take a look at that. Like all of that red tape, we know the province of Ontario now has a minister responsible for red tape reduction. One of our plans at the federal level is to basically for every rule that comes in, you have to take off 2 off the books. We've got to get that red tape cost down. I mean, it should never cost the developer that much money to start building. So that's one piece. Looking at the programs, and I know some of the CMHC programs they have in place. I mean, there's a lot of process. There's a lot of they're fairly cumbersome to go through and fill out. Let's see if we can streamline that process and make the application processes faster. And also builders look at it and, how long it takes to fill it out. They're not necessarily sure they're going to get it. We need to make that whole process much simpler. And I think that's going to translate down to helping builders build faster. We also, and then this goes back to the municipal government. I mean, we know that it sort of takes a couple of years before anything gets built. They're saying 1 to 2 years worth of planning. Let's figure out how to get that number down, because 2 things happen is, one, the developer has to sit on that piece of property. They're paying all these additional costs and then wait. And while they're waiting, that's driving the price of that future product up when it's ready to be sold. But also the municipality loses out on tax revenue because that empty lot is actually worth less than if it was built. And so I think there's a lot of efficiencies that we can be done at the municipal, provincial, and federal level in order to try and streamline this problem.
Now, you mentioned, cutting the red tape, and that's going to bring the cost down for developers. One of the criticisms that I hear about whenever it comes to cutting red tape is that you're deregulating, and that could have impacts on the environment. How do you balance that, maintaining environmental protection, especially given our earlier conversation about climate change, but then also making it easier and more affordable for developers to go in on those projects?
Yeah, so it's a great question, obviously, and you got to take a look. When we say red tape, I mean, there's a lot of process issues that are literally just the process is cumbersome and it takes time. And so I'm not saying that we're going to eliminate environmental protection, because that's not what we're saying, but there's all the other pieces that go along with. I mean, like I said, it takes a long time to move from step A to step B, get zoning clearances, a lot of things that are taken, which we need to look at. Why is it taking so long? Part of it, I think, is workload. And also, I think there should be a much simpler way to streamline that. But again, until we get the people that are doing it every day, so the planners, with the developers, with the provincial government, with the federal government, I think we've got to figure out how to get them, like I said, in a room, and let's figure out how to make this simpler, because it shouldn't be so complicated.
Yeah. All right.
And we have to make it simpler. I mean, otherwise developers aren't going to build. The other thing too is, which I'm very much against, is the Liberal government's been talking about this ability to to have a coupon system where you can move around as someone who's on lower income. Instead of an affordable apartment, having it something that it's portable. Big issues I see with this is that when developers do decide to build an apartment complex that's in the affordable range, one of the reasons they can do that is because they basically know that once they've filled it, their vacancy is basically going to be almost next to nothing, because those individuals that are there are basically locked into a program, and that's why they're able to come to that building. You start making it so those individuals can move around from apartment to apartment, and if the vacancy comes up to 2, 3, 4%, which is not what we are here in Peterborough today, but hopefully we need to get to a much healthier vacancy rate. Now you've got to take that vacancy calculation into the calculation on your rent, and that will actually drive the cost of rent up. And so we've got to make sure that we're not trying to band-aid one solution and that we're turning around and causing a bigger impact.
Okay. So I think that about wraps up the conversation on housing, but we have a couple more topics that we want to get into, but let's take a short break and then we'll come back to it.
Sure, that sounds great.
All right, perfect. All right, so we're back, and let's talk about the last couple of topics before we call it for the day. And next topic that I think needs to be talked about, especially here locally, is the opioid crisis.
Absolutely.
Because we are seeing an alarming number of people here die because of the opioid crisis. We're topping out some pretty disturbing statistics here. So, what is the conservative federal plan for dealing with this crisis? Because we need a solution.
We definitely need a solution. So I guess the first thing is we got to identify a couple things. So I'll start sort of at the federal level and kind of work down from there. So, we know that the deaths, we've had 26 deaths so far in Peterborough, and I don't know how many, 170 or some odd overdoses. Part of it's because of carfentanil, right? So carfentanil is still coming into our country. We need to make sure that the RCMP and our border security has the right tools to stop this from coming in. I mean, we should be treating carfentanil like anthrax or a poison. Like, it's a poison. 1 grain of salt, will kill you. And so the fact that it's not necessarily being treated that way is a big issue. So one of the things I want to see from the federal government, and we've already said that we're going to start cracking down on this and giving the RCMP the right information. The second thing is, and the right tools. The second thing is, we know basically one of the biggest sort of drug dealers, if I could use that term, is mail. And so the Police Chiefs Association in 2016 made some recommendations about giving more power to basically opening up letters. That's been sitting in the Security Council, which is a nonpartisan group for quite some time, basically 2.5 years. We've got to get that out of there. I believe that the police should be opening up envelopes that are suspected of having carfentanil inside of it. Again, 1 grain of salt will kill you, and so 30 grams, which is sort of that magic number between being a letter and a parcel, it's got to be looked at. So if somebody mails 30 grams of carfentanil, I mean, you could kill 30 people with that. And so I think that's something that needs to be looked at. We also need to work very, very closely with our provincial government. As you probably know, I've been working closely with Dave Smith on a harm reduction center and making sure that on all sides, we have to make sure that we have a safe injection site with harm reduction. It's not just about giving people a safe injection site. We've got to make sure the harm reduction piece goes along with it, and that's the counseling services side. Otherwise we're just delaying death. And so that to me is maybe less than what the national plan is, but more is your job as a member of parliament is to be a catalyst. And I believe that if you've got a problem in your community, especially something as serious as an opioid crisis, that you don't say, well, that's a provincial responsibility or a municipal. You say, this is my responsibility as an elected person. I'm going to sit down with the rest of the elected people and our community, and we're going to work on a plan together. And my solemn commitment is that this is something that I'm going to take very, very seriously, and I will work across party lines, different levels of government and across the community to be a catalyst to solve this, because we have to solve this problem.
Mm-hmm. Now, what are your thoughts on, I mean, you had mentioned, advocacy for a consumption site, treatment centers, also, one of those things that people are talking about. Then you have kind of the more out there ideas, such as decriminalizing. So where does the party's kind of stand on that spectrum?
Yeah, so great question. So it's the Portugal model I think you're referring to. The reason Portugal has somewhat worked by decriminalizing is because they have all the wraparound services. We don't have the wraparound services. Now, basically, if you talk to Tim Farquharson, Deputy Chief Farquharson, I mean, we basically have decriminalized drugs in Peterborough. I mean, I think it's been 2 years before anybody was charged with a drug-only offense. Now, obviously, if they're breaking and entering and they're caught with drugs, that's something different. I mean, we're already seeing that. For us as a federal government to take that away, I think we're taking a tool away from the police force that they use today. And sometimes that arrest, that they're arresting someone for possession, they're using that because they're going to be trying to move that person and move them into some kind of harm reduction center. Because we do know a lot of people that are addicted don't necessarily want to get off the addiction or don't know how to get off the addiction. So, we have to kind of intervene as society, and, our police force is sort of the tip of the spear when it comes to intervention and trying to get people in there. And so if we have the right resources for wraparound services, so we have a safe injection site, we've got harm reduction, we've got counseling programs to understand what the actual trauma is and help people cope with the reason why they're taking opioids, I think that's how you wrap that around. Does that mean eventually you decriminalize? I don't know. But right now, we definitely don't have the services at our disposal today, and we have to start working on getting those services for sure.
So enforcement doesn't necessarily need to be in use 24/7, but at the very least, enforcement needs to be a tool that's available. Is that accurate?
That's exactly right. I mean, some people don't listen, right? I mean, and right now, if there was no enforcement, so if the police weren't able to arrest someone to help them, that becomes a problem for sure.
Okay. If you're looking here, you had mentioned actually, advocacy, and that, as an MP, you are an advocate. I guess Dave Smith has said that he wants to go to the bat, and basically, he's made this pledge to bring a consumption site here to Peterborough. I had in the previous episode I had Candace Shaw on, and she had talked about working as a federal NDP government with a provincial progressive conservative government, and the that dichotomy. But with you guys, though, I mean, a federal conservative, federal party, or a federal government, and a progressive conservative provincial government, it seems like there's more room for synergy there, or am I
No, I
overestimating
think
that?
you're right. I mean, obviously, the national party and the provincial party is different. Sometimes I wish our prime minister and our current MP would realize that they are two different things. There's a federal and provincial, and that really those two things have to work together. But there isn't, one doesn't control the other. But yeah, I believe that myself, I mean, both Dave Smith and myself both believe very much in this community. We want to see the best of this community, and yeah, so I think it would be very easy for me to work with Dave Smith to make sure that this happens, and obviously I will. I mean, I've made that pledge. Dave is at this point is basically looking for a petition to be completed, because there is a certain number of names on a petition. I've been working with a few of our landlords to sort of see if we can figure out a location, because there's a couple of requirements to get a safe injection site with the harm reduction. Is that you need to have a location, and you need to have the community's involvement, and so that process has been ongoing. And as a federal representative, I would be backing Dave up, or whoever the MPP down the road is as well. I mean, I may be an MP much longer than Dave for whatever reason, and if it ended up being an NDP MPP, I would still work with them to get problems solved. I mean, at the end of the day, you need to represent your community first. Obviously our party has different philosophies, and you kind of get involved in the politics under that umbrella of a certain party. But you better understand you're riding first, and that's where your number one priority should be.
And that was the question that I was going to be getting at, was that how do you, the flags might be the same color for a certain length of time, and I couldn't begin to predict what could happen in the provincial election in 2.5 years, however long we have left in that term. But we might see another term of the progressive conservative government. We might see a different. So how do you go about kind of working, especially in terms of a portfolio like the opioid crisis, where lives are at stake and you really can't afford to be bickering at each other?
And you don't, right? At the end of the day, your job, once you're elected, and I realize during a campaign time, everyone has their individual platforms. But partisan politics has to be put aside. I mean, to your point, you just said, I mean, people are dying. And so that needs to be your number one priority, is how do we stop people from dying? And you're elected to represent your community. You're elected by a percentage of people in the community, but once those people they may have elected you, your job is to represent everybody in the community. And so I think the hyperpartisan politics that we've seen in the United States, we are seeing now in Canada as well, is we've got to see it go away, because it's not good for society, and quite frankly, it's not good for democracy either.
And that leads perfectly into kind of the last conversation that I had wanted to have with you, which was talking about how kind of messy politics have gotten, and you can kind of trace it back pretty recently. I would say there's certainly a trend that goes back longer, but like I would say over the past like 4 or 5, maybe 6 years, you can kind of chart how personal politics has gotten at times. And I don't know if that's influence coming from the United States, or if that's just the way politics is now. But like, what do you think of the state of politics as it is right now? And especially, how do you plan on rising above that? Or do you plan on partaking in it?
Yeah, so good point. So I ran back in 2015, and it's interesting because we ran here in Peterborough, and definitely not across the country. I mean, for the most part, all of the candidates that ran were very much focused on policy, and there wasn't necessarily a lot of kind of back and forth. At the national level, obviously between Mr. Harper and Mr. Trudeau, there was a bunch of back and forth pieces, and the other pieces as well, the other national leaders as well. But this time it's interesting, because there's definitely a little bit more back and forth at the local level. But it's partly because and I wrestle with this a little bit as somebody who comes out of business. And so in business, you typically don't talk about your competitor. You might make sure your strengths are very clearly aligned, especially if it happens to line up with one of your competitor's weaknesses. But politics does drive a bit more of this debate, and people look at politics expecting to see a bit of a battle of the words. And so there is a bit of that, and I kind of write the analogy back to hockey, for example. I mean, a lot of people go to a hockey game not to see a goal, but to see a fight. And so I do find that politics and quite frankly the media is always looking for a bit of a story, because it does get people's excitement up there. And so I think that's part of it. The U.S. obviously is at a hyper partisanship right now, and that's obviously spilling over into Canada as well. I think locally, I mean, we've got some great candidates that are running, and I'm hoping when we're all done, obviously I'm hoping to be the member of parliament, but quite frankly, I think all of the people that are running, or at least most of them, will do something for our community and will contribute in a different way, and I'm going to want to work with them. And so I have to make sure that I don't I'm not too aggressive, and I'm hoping the rest of the candidates are the same way, and that they're in a situation where they want to work with me as well afterwards, because I think partisan politics, and I said that earlier, is something that's not good for society as much as it is. It is part of politics because you run on a platform and you run on a team, but you've got to put your riding first. And for me, when I ran back in 2015, one of the questions that you're asked when you go through the interview about being a candidate is, if you had to make a decision in the best interest of your riding or the best interest of the party, what would you do? I would always make the decision in the best interest of the riding. And so I made that clear then. Obviously, I was accepted in 2015, and that hasn't changed. And obviously, like I said earlier, you've got to work as a team. You've got colleagues they're going to need to support you. You need to support them, and so that's obviously part of it. But at the end of the day, your riding has to be best, and you've always got to put the best interests of your riding forward.
Yeah, and if you look at some people who have served in politics in Peterborough's past, or even just run on a local level, these are all mostly, a large number of them, I should say, people who stay in the community, and these are people who care and are very interested and continue to be involved. So, you look at, let's say theoretically, you do win and you become MP. Well, all these people that you're running against right now, they aren't going to drop off the face of the world and phase out of existence like they just got Thanos snapped. Like they're gonna continue to be involved in the community, and your part as an elected representative is to represent them and work with them.
Absolutely, for sure. And so I mean that's part of it, right? And obviously I was born in this riding. I mean, I built businesses here. I mean, my family's here. I mean, I'm not planning on leaving this riding. Whether win or lose, obviously I'm very much driving to be the member of parliament and after October 22nd. But the same thing I said in 2015. I mean, when I lost to 2015, I mean, I stayed in the riding and I shifted my focus, and I focused more on the innovation cluster, and then eventually became the CEO. And my big driver in 2015 was jobs, and I was able to accomplish that a different way. And so I think you're going to find, hopefully, everybody that's running, ends up finding their kind of home in an organization that's going to do something better. Because at the end of the day, running is a lot of responsibility. It takes a lot of effort on your part of your family and your own personal time, and so you need to do that for the right reasons. And I think making sure that you're putting the riding first is the only reason you're running.
Now, when it comes to, I just want to bring social media into the conversation, because my personal theory is that one of the reasons why politics has gotten so divided recently is because social media kind of creates a breeding ground for people to have those conversations. And I say conversations in the nice way, because sometimes they devolve into arguments all the times, and people become very they can collect and kind of stew, and they create a culture online. So how do you rise above that? How do you not take part in that when you have voices on social media screaming at you, and then maybe those people show up at your office and want to scream at you? How do you rise above that?
So that's a good question. For me, I mean, I typically don't engage in social media if someone starts attacking me, right? We put a lot of platform. I mean, I use it as a two-way communication. It doesn't depend on whether it's Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, but I typically use it as a way to push out an idea and have, I would say, responsible dialogue. When somebody, starts attacking me, I just ignore them. It's different, obviously, if they come to the Constituent office. It's also different if they send an email. If somebody emails me, I respond back. But if somebody, tags me in a tweet and says something negative, and obviously in politics it happens. I mean, I get it daily. Somebody says something which is untrue or unfounded. I haven't engaged, and it's something that I personally wrestle with, because I don't know. Should I engage? Should I not? I mean, obviously we've got a president, south of the border that engages on everything, and
It's probably not very good for his health.
it's an interesting for sure. And so, I do. One of the biggest challenges I see with social media is it has this bit of a mob effect. And so, what you might get at a protest where somebody in the back of the room starts yelling something, because they feel that they're anonymous. You get that sort of every day with social media. And so, I do balance with how much communication do I do through social media as a platform versus what would I use for email or, quite frankly, a face-to-face meeting. I still think face-to-face meetings and phone calls are typically more respectful and then some of the stuff that you see on social media. But it's definitely changing. I mean, one of the other things too, and just from my last campaign to this campaign, we have so many new ways to communicate. I get sign requests from an Instagram post, Twitter, a Facebook message to me, a Facebook message to our EDA. Obviously, then you get phone calls and the normal stuff like filling out the form on the website.
Does anyone
request
try to
sign.
professionally contact you about the campaign through LinkedIn?
Yes, I've got a number of people through LinkedIn. So LinkedIn actually for me is a bit more of a vehicle that I use just because of my professional background, but I'm not sure everybody does that. But yeah, I've got messages from LinkedIn for sign requests as well. And so for me, I'm always trying to manage all of these different profiles, and then even like things like WhatsApp and stuff like that, because I'm on WhatsApp because of some of my international stuff. People will send me a message on WhatsApp and it'll pop up on my phone, and if I don't, I'm like, I know I got a sign request, but and I'm going through all these different mediums, and I'm spending like 15 minutes going through every medium to say like which messenger, and did they message my page, did they message me personally. And so yeah, I think that's a challenge for anybody, and whether it's in business or politics, is that I wish there was some kind of unified messaging tool that basically took everything and just put it into one bucket, because it's we can send messages to people so way more ways than we could in the past.
All right. I think we're just about to wrap up, but I'll leave it with you. Is there any other things that you want to mention or any messages that you want to get across while we're here?
I think obviously just, I think we've got a lot of issues here in our riding. One of the things we didn't talk about was affordability, but I think that, whether it is the housing crisis, which we talked about, or it's just the fact there's a lot of people that are having a lot harder times making ends meet. And so I think this riding is hurting, and we definitely need to get representation there that's going to sort of make sure that the riding's looked after first. Number one thing for me is going to make sure that, the problems we have in this, this riding, whether they're federal, provincial, or municipal, that I'll act as a leader and a catalyst to try and get them solved, and to work with my colleagues at all levels of government, as well as the community, to try and get them solved.
All right. Thank you so much, Mike, for coming in, and best of luck on the campaign.
Thank you very much.